The purpose of this video lesson is to provide an overview of the Civil War, beginning with Part 1, the causes of the war. The deepest causes of the Civil War go all the way back to 1776 and the birth of the United States, to the Declaration of Independence, in which Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal. But Jefferson could not have meant all men, as an owner of some 600 enslaved people. The fact was, many whites at that time didn't consider blacks to be human, much less equal to themselves. 11 years later, little had changed for enslaved Americans, although the U.S. had won its independence and written its own constitution. This document laid out the structure of the government, and above all, it promised its citizens the protection of their lives, liberty, and property. But again, enslaved blacks were not protected. They were not considered citizens. They were the property of white citizens. And so the U.S., which claimed to want liberty and justice for all, guaranteed it only to a privileged few. And the institution of slavery was not only allowed to exist, but to expand. But slavery didn't expand everywhere. In the northern states, slave labor was gradually replaced by factory production. And one by one, once they had ceased to rely on it, these states outlawed slavery. In the South, however, slavery became more and more important to the cotton-growing economy, and no one talked of abolishing it. Between 1820 and 1850, a new challenge arose. The country was expanding, and new states were joining. Would these new states join the country as free states or slave states? In 1820, there was an even balance of 11 slave states and 11 free states. But when Missouri applied to join as a slave state, the free states felt themselves outnumbered. To restore the balance, Maine was added as a free state. And so it went for 30 years. Whenever a slave state joined, a free state was added to balance it out. The problem of slavery that so divided the nation went unsolved. But as long as free and slave states were evenly balanced, the country could continue to expand without open conflict. Some, including not yet President Abraham Lincoln, believed this balance could not last, that the country would eventually have to decide to become all one thing or all the other. In any case, the Balancing Act worked until 1850, when California applied for statehood as a free state. The slave states objected, seeing this as a major threat, and promised to secede or break away and form their own country if California was admitted as free. Everyone knew this would lead to war, and to avoid that, Congress passed a law to convince the slave states to stay. It was called the Fugitive Slave Act, and it was something the South had wanted for quite some time. A fugitive is someone who has escaped their imprisonment, and for a long time this was the main way that Black Americans resisted slavery. You probably already know a thing or two about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad, which helped enslaved people escape to the North where they would be free. For years, Southern slaveholders had complained that nothing was done to return escaped slaves. The new Fugitive Slave Act addressed these complaints by making it illegal to assist the runaways. It required all free blacks, even those who had legally purchased their freedom, to carry documents proving that they had not run away. And if those documents could not be produced, it allowed federal police to act as slave catchers, arresting suspected runaways, even in the free North, and returning them to Southern plantations. These changes angered many in the North, especially abolitionists, who resisted the law, posting warnings that free blacks should avoid police and government officials. In some places, there was armed resistance. When federal slave catchers knocked on the door of William Parker's house in Christiana, Pennsylvania, they were met with gunfire, and a riot ensued. This was 1851. By the end of that decade, things had gotten worse, and some, including white abolitionists like John Brown, had shown that they were willing to fight and die to end slavery. In one of the most famous anti-slavery rebellions in U.S. history, John Brown and 22 other black and white men took up arms and stormed a government armory in Harpers Ferry, Virginia. Their plan was to overthrow the U.S. government and replace it with one that would outlaw slavery. The uprising failed, and Brown was executed, but his story showed that the country was at a breaking point. The next year, Abraham Lincoln was elected President of the United States. As we will see, Lincoln was no abolitionist, but he was nominated by the new anti-slavery Republican Party. The Southern states saw his election as a major threat. 11 Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederated States of America, or the Confederacy. The Civil War was set to begin.